Okay, it's time to rig this character. I'm going to start with the arm and then moving on to the legs, the body, the head, and then the details of the character. So let's start with the left arm. I'm going to solo the left arm to be able to focus on that. In order to bend this arm, we need to create puppet pins inside of After Effects. For a typical arm, we need to have one pin for the shoulder, one for the elbow, and one for the wrist. I'm going to use the puppet pin tool and I'm going to place the pins on that selected layer. So one for the shoulder, one for the elbow, and one for the wrist. For the wrist itself, since this is going to become the anchor point or rotation point for the hand, I'm going to be a little bit careful in terms of placement of that. You will use the guide that you have created inside of Photoshop. I'm going to enable that and I'm going to reposition this pin to be exactly in the center of this guide that I've created. So under the mesh, I'm going to remove the puppet pin 3, highlight mesh number 1, and I'm going to place the pin exactly in the center of this wrist. When we place pins on a layer, they come as puppet pins as an effect under that layer. You can test the functionality of these pins by selecting either one of them and then using your move tool, and you can just start moving it around. However, there are some problems with these pins that makes them impractical for animation purposes. The first problem with these pins is that they only have position property, they do not have rotation. That's a major issue. The other one is that we cannot make any hierarchy on them, so I can't parent pin 3 to pin 2 or pin 2 to pin 1. And lastly, they are very hard to access. You can see that they are hidden under a mesh, under an effect under that layer. That makes them very impractical for animation purposes. So for those reasons, rather than animating these pins, we make an actual pin layer for each one of them to solve all of those issues. So in order to make pins for each one of these puppet pins, the first thing is to rename them. So when you make the pins automatically for them, it carries those names that we have created here as well. You just need to hit return or enter. And this is my shoulder, this is elbow, and this is wrist or hand. Then I just need to highlight all of them, and in the links and constraints, I just need to add pins for them. When I click on that, it will make one layer for each one of these pins. It will name them pin for that specific layer, for that specific puppet pin. So it says pin for left arm, for the shoulder pin. And also it will make the connections for us as well. So now you can see that this position is having an expression on it, and that expression is making the connection to those layers for us. In order to test that, I can simply grab one of these newly created pins and I can just move them around, and you can see that those are actually moving the puppet pins for me. To show you that now we can also create hierarchy on these pins, I can simply make a parenting here, and now I can grab, for example, the elbow, and I can start rotating the elbow, and now you can see that it's moving the wrist pin for me. Another problem that you might notice here is that when I start rotating these pins, the bend that I get on this layer is not what I like. In some cases, you want to get this organic, curvy, noodly kind of bend on the elbow, but sometimes you want to get a pointy elbow. Let's understand what has happened and what is causing that. If I expand my left arm and go back to my mesh and enable my puppet pin, you can see that the puppet pin tool makes a mesh, and you can see that this mesh is having a very uniform detail, and that causes that a smooth curved bend on the elbow. I want to get a pointy elbow. I'm going to use a new type of puppet pin, which is called puppet starch pin, and I'm going to use that to manually add more detail wherever I want, and that results in a more pointy bend on my elbow. To be able to see the result while I'm experimenting with the placement of the puppet starch tool, I'm going to go back to the default rotation, and I'm going to keyframe the rotation of the elbow. It doesn't matter how long the animation is, we just want to see the result. So I'm going to bend it forward. Now I have this nice animation on it, so I can test how I'm placing the puppet starch pins. So in order to add puppet pins or puppet starch pins to a layer that is already having a deformation on, you just need to make sure that you are highlighting the mesh that has the pins on it. So when you place new pins on it, it will actually include them under the same mesh deformer. I'm going to change my puppet pin tool to puppet starch pin tool by holding down the puppet position pin tool, and I'm going to experiment with the placement of this puppet starch tool. I'm going to just intentionally place it somewhere wrong, and now you can see that it's adding more detail around that puppet starch tool. I can even test the result. That's why I made those keyframes. If that's what you like, move on. If not, you can either undo or remove this new puppet pin, and you can place it somewhere else. To my experience, if I place that puppet starch tool somewhere around the elbow, it will give me a better result. So now you can see that the elbow is bent a little bit more pointy. I can undo and reposition that. I'm getting a better pointy bend on the elbow. So now I can go back and remove the animation on the elbow. These pins are already appropriate for animation. However, in order to use some of other tools that DUIK Angela offers, it's best if we actually create bones for this setup rather than directly animating these pins. You just need to highlight them, and under the bones menu, you will go to hominid menu and you will click on these three dots here, click on the arm, that it will place bones for each one of these pins that we have created. They are more visually showing the hierarchy, as well as it will allow us to use some of other tools that DUIK Angela offers. We have the arm bone. This B stands for bone. We have forearm bone, we have hand bone, and lastly we have the arm tip bone. This last one is not that important, so I'm going to turn on the hand and I'm going to place it somewhere around the tip of the fingers. It's only a visual representation of the direction of the hand bone. These bones come with hierarchy already made for them, which means that if I start rotating one of these bones, the rest of the hierarchy is going to follow that. The next step is to finally create a controller for this hand. You just need to highlight all these bones and use the AutoRig tool to create the controller for it. Okay, the controller is made. I'm going to connect each one of these pins to their corresponding bone. So the shoulder follows the arm bone, the elbow joint or elbow pin follows the forearm bone, and lastly the arm pin is going to follow the hand bone. We just need to make sure that the hand is also following the setup, since this is an individual layer. So I'm going to select the hand layer and I'm going to parent it to the hand bone. You can see that the controller is controlling the entire arm setup. I can rotate the controller and it's going to rotate the hand for me as well. In order to do some cleanup here and be able to see the deformations, I'm going to hide the pins. I no longer want to see them. The bones themselves, I'm going to hide them as well. All the bones are supposed to be hidden, and now I'm only dealing with one controller that controls the entire setup. I'm going to also turn off the guide that I have created in Photoshop as well. Last thing that I will do is that I'm going to move just the shape of this hand controller so I can actually see the deformations. So on the controller itself, under the icon, which means just this shape, not the anchor point of it, I'm going to reposition this somewhere else. And now you can see that still the anchor point is right on the wrist. However, just the shape of this controller is somewhere out, so I can see the shapes themselves. I can rotate this and it will rotate the hand for me. One more thing about dealing with these bones is that by default, sometimes DUIK names them not in a way that you like. For example, it also named them front left, and so on. However, my character is only having left arm and right arm. So in order to rename the bones and the controllers, you can select all of them and you can go to bone setting and you can say change the side to left, right, up, down, or anything. As for the location, I'm going to enable that and set it to none. And it's going to remove all of those fronts from the names here as well. Apparently it doesn't affect the controller, so I'm going to rename this manually. So we are happy with this left arm. I'm going to do the same thing for the right arm. Okay, I'm done with the right arm too. I'm going to also add a puppet starch tool on this arm as well to get a little bit better deformation. Very well, so I'm going to hide anything that I do not want to see anymore. And I'm going to save. In order to show what we have done in terms of dealing with the puppet pins and the bones, I have this slide. This is our arm shape layer. In order to deform it, we add puppet pins on them. These puppet pins are not suitable for animation or character setup, so we added DUIK pins on them. And then in order to properly rig them, we created bones for each one of these and then made the connections all together. We are having bones that are moving the DUIK pins that are moving the puppet pins. We no longer want to deal with these puppet pins, so we are going to eventually lock and hide them, and anything else that happens throughout the entire character setup happens on these bones. So all the riggings, all the controllers, anything else will happen on these bones. One more last thing about dealing with these controllers is that if you notice here, we are able to move and rotate these controllers. So if I rotate this controller, it will rotate the wrist. If I move this around, it will move the entire arm for me. With the rotations, if I want to go back to my original default pose, I can simply just zero out the rotation value. However, the position is not originally a default 0 value. If I zero out the values here, you can see that it will move the controller back to 0, 0 here. So that's not ideal. It's hard to guess or memorize what was the original default value for this controller. We are going to use some of the tools that DUIK offers, which is zeroing out this controller in this workspace that it's sitting at. I'm going to select that controller and I'm going to links and constraints menu and I'm going to click on add 0. That will make a locked hidden null layer that is going to become apparent for this controller now. The position of this controller is 0, which means that if I move this around, I can always go back to the default value of it. I'm going to do the same thing for the right controller as well. So I'm going to add a 0 for it. And that will be sitting here. Right arm controller is now having a 0 value, which means that I can always go back to the default position of it. When it's time to do the final cleanup and connections, we need to keep in mind that we have these two layers as a parent of this controller. So when I get into the master controller, we need to make sure that we respect this hierarchy that this zeroing out process is creating for us. So for now, let's just move on to the legs and continue rigging up the legs of this character. Before I continue rigging the legs and the upper body, I'm going to do some basic cleanup here. Since we're no longer going to use the bones or the pins or even the shape layers, we can actually hide them and shy them from the timeline and the viewport. Now I'm going to just hide and shy anything other than the arm bone or the shoulder, because eventually I need to connect it to my entire body. So I'm going to select everything except for the shoulders and I'm going to shy them and turn on the shy button so they will no longer be visible in the timeline. I can simply just shy all of the pins here as well. And since the shape layers are no longer going to be animated themselves, we can shy them as well. The hands are also going to be dealt with eventually. For now, I can just keep them available and I can now move on to each one of the legs. For the legs, we need to have pins for wherever we want to have the bends. So we're going to start with the hip, the knee, the ankle. Since we are going to also bend the toes, we need to have one pin for the base of the toe. We call it foot ball joint, as well as one last joint to be representing the tip of the toe. I'm going to create one pin for each one of these joints that I need to have. That's the hip, that's the knee. Ankle usually is somewhere around the ankle area of our feet. For the football joint, since it's going to be defining where the toes are going to bend, I'm going to place that somewhere on the ground, right on the base of the toes. And lastly, the tip of the toe, which can be on the tip of the drawing itself. So let's rename these pins. This is the hip, knee, ankle, football. I'm going to just name it ball, and then lastly the toe. Similar to before, we are going to create pins for all of these, add pins. It's time to create the bones for them. So I'm going to select them. The order of selection is important. So I'm going to select the hip pin and hold down shift and select the toe pin. Then I'm going to go to Hominoid option box and I'm going to create a leg setup here. Let's just see if we get all what we want. So it seems that we are missing some bones here. Although we have 5 pins here, it only created 3 bones for us. So we need to enforce it to respect all of these 5 pins that we have here. So I'm going to undo that. And this time, rather than just clicking on the leg, I'm going to click on this gear to go to the options of it. And it's going to open up this pop-up window and I'm going to create the toes bones as well. So I'm going to enable that and I'm going to click on the leg setup one more time. So we got our 5 bones here. This is the thigh bone, the calf bone, the foot bone, the toes bone, and we have the leg tip bone as well as the heel bone. All of these 4 bones are made properly and their anchor point is sitting exactly on the pins. However, the last one, we need to manually place it where the heel is. This helps us to create a reverse foot setup. When I get into the attributes that we get, I'm going to explain what that means. Let's rename these bones. Go to the bone tool and bone setting. And this is my left leg. So I'm going to keep it as left. And as for the location, I'm going to select none and apply. And I'm going to now ask DUIK to auto-rig these bones for me. Auto-rig. Perfect. We got the leg controller. If I grab the leg controller and bring it up, you can see that it's bending the knee for me. Let's also take care of parenting these pins to the bones as well. I'm going to manually parent each one of these joints to their corresponding bone. So the hip joint connects to the thigh bone, the knee joint connects to the calf bone, ankle to the foot bone, the ball pin will be connected to the toes bone, and the toes pin will be connected to the toes bone as well. So both of the ball and the toe pin will be connected to the toe ball. I'm going to grab the controller, bring the leg up. I'm going to rotate the controller. And now if I go to the effects that are sitting on the controller, you can see we have other attributes here as well that helps us to get more advanced deformations on the foot. The toes slider is going to bend the toes for me. The tiptoe is going to allow me to do a tiptoe on the leg. The heel is going to be rotating the foot from the heel. And we have the foot roll that is a combination of the heel and tiptoe. So if I go positive, it's going to bend the foot from the heel, and it's going negative, it's going to bend the foot from the foot ball joint. So I'm going to undo this, and I'm going to also zero out the values on the foot controller. So similar to before, I'm going to go to the links and constraints and add 0 to this controller to zero out the position values of it as well. I'm going to hide all of these bones except for the thigh for now, and I'm going to hide all of these pins as well. For the thigh, I'm going to hide it, but I will not shy it for now. I will shy the rest of them. And now we are dealing with only one controller, and again, eventually I'm going to take care of the thigh and all of the shoulders as well. I can also add a starch tool on the knee here just to make the deformation to be a little bit more pointy. Leg deformation, go to the deform effect and add a puppet starch on the knee. So let's do the same thing for the right leg. Let's make sure that things are functional. The toes are working, tiptoe is working, heel rotation is working, and foot roll. I will also zero out the controller itself, links and constraints at 0. And I'm going to lastly add a starch tool to get a pointy bend on the knee. Let's take care of hiding and shying the layers that we want. So the right leg, I'm going to shy it. All these pins need to be hidden and also shy, as well as the bones. So for the bones, I'm going to hide everything, including the thigh, and I'm going to shy everything except the thigh for now. All right, let's go back to our default position. I'm going to move these shapes of the controllers back so I can see the drawings themselves. That's my right controller, and this is my left leg controller. It's time to work on the torso. In this case, this layer is called dress, and we're going to see how we can approach rigging this torso. Usually the hierarchy starts from the area that we call it center of gravity, which is somewhere between the two hips. In this case, since this character's body is actually the dress itself, we need to consider that this layer is containing not just the body, but also the skirt or the dress itself. So when I'm placing the pins, I need to make sure that I place the hips or the first pin of the upper body somewhere that is close to the hips that is coming from the legs. And this is a good guide for me where to place the root or center of gravity or the hips joint on the dress. Usually for the body, we need to have at least 3 joints. If I want to get some swings on the dress itself, I can add 2 more pins here. The reason why I'm adding 2 pins is that for any kind of rotation, when I'm dealing with deformations or pins, I need to have at least 2 pins to be able to define a rotation for the pin before the last one. So I'm going to name these pins. The first one is spine 01, spine 02, spine 03. For these two, since the dress is going to be attached to the root, the hierarchy is going to be going from top to bottom. Now let's create the pins for them. Okay, we got the pins. Sometimes for myself, I go with only a very simple FK setup for the body. In that case, I no longer need to create bones or anything. I just simply can make the hierarchy on these spines as well as the skirt. So skirt number 2 is going to be the child of skirt number 1. Skirt number 1 is going to be a child of the spine 01. With this setup, if I start rotating the spine, the entire upper body is following it. I can bend the spine from the middle point. And since I have the skirt 1 here as well, I can can rotate the lower body using this bone too. However, since again, I want to use some of the features that DUIK Angela offers, I'm going to not make the hierarchy on these pins directly, but rather I'm going to make bones and also create controllers for them. So unparent all of these, set it to none, and I'm going to make the bones for the torso. I'm going to click on these three dots here, and I'm going to open up the settings for the spine and see what I have here. In this case, since I do want to have one center hips joint here as well, I'm going to create a guide layer here to act as anchor point for the hips, which is technically something in between the two hips of the legs. For that reason, I'm going to temporarily turn on the two thighs here. I'm going to create a null for now, which eventually I'm going to delete and drop it somewhere in between the two hips, which is in this case called the thighs of my legs. I'm going to just name it hips so I can easily recognize that. So in order to use DUIK Angela's hominoid spine setup, the order of selection is important. We need to select the hips, then all the spine joints, then the neck, and also the head. Before I do so though, I need to make sure that the anchor point of these two layers are in a proper position, because DUIK Angela is going to refer to these anchor points to place the bones for me. So for the neck, I'm going to use the pan behind tool to grab the anchor point for the neck and drop it somewhere that I want the rotations to happen, as well as for the head. So I'm going to place the anchor point somewhere that the neck meets the head. Usually it's somewhere close to the jawline. And now it's time to select the layers one by one. Select the hips, then all the three spine joints, then the neck, then the head. Now let's go to hominoid, select the spine, go to the settings, make sure that the head, the number of spine joints, the number of neck joints, and the hips are to our liking. I'm going to select the spine with those options that I chose, and eventually I'm going to get the bones that I need to have for rigging the upper body. The last joint here is again just a guide for us to define the orientation of the head. The placement of it is not that crucial. We got the bones, so I'm going to one by one parent each one of these pins to their corresponding bone. So in this case, spine 1 is going to be parented to the spine bone here, spine 2, spine 2. In this case, spine 3 is named torso. And then I have the neck connects to the neck bone, and finally the head is going to be connected to the head. I can simply just parent the skirt 2 to skirt 1, and skirt 1 parented to the first joint of the spine. So this hips bone here is going to be the parent of both the legs. So in this case, it's time to attach the legs to the hips. Since the character's arms are also rigged, I do have the arms bone here as well. These are the two bones that yet are not connected to anything. So I'm going to grab these two bones for the arms and connect them to the torso, and I no longer want to see them, so I'm going to turn them off. It's time to create the controllers and get all of those fancy IK features that comes with the torso setup. I no longer need this hips guide here. I'm going to delete that, and I'm going to select all the bones here for the upper body, and I'm going to ask DUIK Angela to auto rig them. Okay, we got all the fancy controllers here. You can just experiment with them and see what their positions and the rotations do, just to get a good sense of how they are working. Eventually, we're going to just focus on some of the main controllers here for animation purposes, and we're going to ignore some of them that I would consider them secondary controllers. But just to give you a brief demonstration of each one of these controllers, I would say the body controller would be your main controller that is going to control the entire character altogether. I'm going to unsolo everything so I can see the arms and the legs here as well. I do not want to see the bones anymore, so I'm going to hide all the bones. I can actually use this switch or select the bones here and just turn them off. So let's grab the body controller, and I'm going to move it up and down. Legs are bending with it, the arms are connected, the shoulders are connected to the upper body. I can rotate it as well. You can see that I get all the features for the upper body. For example, the head is staying flat. We can switch to another space. We call it space switch. So I'm going to select the head controller. Down here, I can turn on the follow feature. Now you can see that the head is following the orientation of the upper body. Some of these controllers are only functional for their position. Some of them are only functional for the rotation. For example, this one, the rotation is locked, so the rotation doesn't do anything. The torso, in this case, I can rotate it. It will affect the upper body. I can grab it and move it up and down, and it will affect the upper body as well. The shoulders and neck, move it around, and you can see that things are connected properly. So I'm going to grab all of the facial features, eyes, mouth, Hair ribbons, eventually I'm gonna rig them, so for now it's fine if I just parent them to the head. Hair side, ear, they can all be connected either to the head or to the head bone, so it doesn't matter. Hair tail, again, for now I'm going to connect them to the head. Eventually when we place the pins for them, we're gonna take care of the hierarchy on those pins. So let's grab the body and see things. I connected the thighs to the hips, and that means that if I grab the hips controller and start rotating that, you can see that I'm getting this kind of dance effect on the hips area. We no longer need to see these bones, so I'm going to hide them. I can lock them, and I need to shine them as well. These two extra layers, they come with the rigging process. I'm going to shine them too. I took care of all of the thighs and the arm bones, so I'm going to shine them as well, and eventually I'm going to shine the artwork as well. I'm going to turn on the pins too and also shine them. This hips controller is going to be a secondary controller for me, so I'm going to make it slightly smaller. I can even give it another color. Usually the center controllers, I give them a yellowish color to distinguish them from the side controllers. I would consider it a secondary controller. I can turn it off. The spine controller, I guess I can turn that off. Spine curve as well. The torso, I like to keep it on, but I'm going to change the size of it to become a little bit smaller. And the head controller, I can simply just grab it and bring it up, just the icon, so it's not interfering with my artwork. For the body controller, since this is going to be a main controller for me, I'm going to make it slightly larger and move it somewhere that is not on the drawings themselves. This is my shoulder and neck. I would consider this one also a secondary controller, so I'm going to turn that off. I'm going to just leave the torso on. We need to do some other cleanups on these controllers too, but I'm going to leave them for later. Let's test it out one more time. I'm going to grab the body and start rotating it, and I'm going to move it up and down. Okay, let's save it as a new version and we can move on to the next stage. Now it's time to set up the details of this character, including the hair, facial features, and even this sleeve that we have for this character. So I'm going to start with the simple ones, this side hair here. If it was a very small detail here, I could just simply move its anchor point to where I want the rotation to happen, and I could just parent it to the head, and then it would have some overlapping rotations on it. Since this is not that small, I prefer to have it to also be able to bend and deform as well, to give it a little bit more smooth and natural movement. So for that reason, I'm going to use the puppet pins in this case as well, and I'm going to give it at least 3 pins, because anything below 3 pins won't deform that mesh. For such cases that I'm dealing with only one layer, there is no actual need for renaming the pins, because eventually the pins will inherit the name of the layer as well. So as long as the numbering is in the correct order, you should be all good. So I'm going to create the actual pins for these puppet pins. I'm going to make the hierarchy on these pins. I'm going to get this nice bend on it, and the base one is also available in case I want to have 2 points of rotation for this layer. For any given forward kinematic setup, the last pin is not going to do anything, so eventually we're going to hide it and shine it and lock it. Now it's time to make sure that these pins are a part of our hierarchy. Originally I have parented the layer itself to the head, but now that I'm using puppet pins to deform that, this hierarchy that I have on the shape layer is no longer valid. It can be parented to anything, but it's not going to follow that parent just because it's now being controlled by these pins. Now I need to make sure that this puppet pin 1, the base pin, is actually connected to my head. So I'm going to grab that and parent it to the head layer. I can parent it directly to the head or the bone that I have for the head, really doesn't matter. Now if I grab the head or the head controller and I start playing with it, you can see that the hair is following. Eventually when it's time to do the animation, I will get to the expressions and I will show you how we can automate some of these actions on the hair and all of these details without even being worried about setting keyframes on them. I'm going to do the same thing for these hair ribbons. So if you notice here, these hair ribbons are separated as I showed in Photoshop. That's why we have them contained in one single composition. If I want to do the same thing and place pins for each one of these, I need to dive into this composition and place the pins inside that composition. So this is the first time I'm getting into one of these compositions. Let's first see how these compositions are made. So I'm going to double click on this. The length of this composition, the frame rate of this composition composition is similar to my main composition, which is great if we have followed all of the steps that I mentioned at the first lesson. The only thing that is not carried over is the resolution. You can see that the resolution of these pre-comps are also 1920 by 1080, which is coming from my document size. This is a waste of pixel. We need to make sure that we clean it up. We need to make sure that we crop it and make it as small as possible so we are not wasting resources of our computer when it's time to do the animation. In order to crop something like this, you can either guess values in the composition setting and just type in pixel values here. There's a chance that your artwork might get out of the canvas. There's another option that I can use to crop this, which is using the region of interest. So I'm going to enable region of interest, draw a rectangular shape, which is acting as a kind of crop tool. So I drew a region of interest, yet I have not cropped it. I want to make sure that it's large enough so when I start rotating or bending these artworks, they do not get out of the new size for the composition. I think that's enough. Composition, crop composition to region of interest. If I get out of this pre-comp and get to my main composition, that composition is out of place. So we need to manually bring it back into its position. Now it's time to start rigging the ribbons as well. So for each one of these ribbons, I'm going to add at least 3 pins. For this little one, I don't think we need pins because it's small enough that we don't care about the bend on it. It's time to make the pins for all of these puppet pins. I got all the 6 pins for the 2 ribbons. I no longer want to deal with these 2 ribbons that I have placed the pins on. I'm going to leave the ribbon A here available just because it's not having any pins on it. So I'm going to change the color of one of them to something else. Going back out, it's time to do the same thing for the hair. First thing first, I'm going to crop this. Since this is the hair, I'm going to give it a little bit more room to be able to have nice bends on them in case I want to get crazy with the motions on it. Making sure that it's now back in place. You might have noticed that I didn't move the anchor point of this composition to the base of the ribbons just because I'm going to take care of the animation inside that composition. So I'm not going to animate this composition or rotate this composition anymore, which means that I no longer need to fix its pivot point back in the base. We have the same situation for the hair. So I do not care about this anchor point anymore. I'm going to place pins for each one of these strands of the hair. In this case, I'm going to go more than 3 pins just because it's a little bit longer. So 1, 2, 3, all the way to 5 or 6 for the other hair. The way I place these pins is that if I'm seeing some kind of change of curvature, I respect those change of directions or turning points to respect the bend that I already have on the artwork. Okay, it's time to create the actual pins for them. The shape layers are no longer needed. I'm going to lock them, shy them. Okay, we are done with these ones as well. And let's get out of this pre-comp. I'm going to close the other pre-comps too. So for these sleeves, I started practicing with the placement of the pins on them, and I noticed that because of the way this character is designed and the way these sleeves are connected to the arms, I wasn't satisfied with the way the arm was bending and the sleeve was attached to the arm. Just to show you, I'm going to do it once, and then I'm going to show you how we can deal with these kind of challenges that requires us to go back to Photoshop and modify some of the layers. Let's focus on the left sleeve and left arm. So if it was a simple design and the attachment between this element to the arm was not in a critical situation, in this case, for example, around the elbow, it would be just as simple as just placing pins for that and then setting it up in forward kinematic and then connecting the base pin to, for example, the shoulder or the elbow. I'm going to actually create the pins for them. Let's make the hierarchy on them. And for the base pin, we can just connect it to the bone of the upper arm. Left arm bone, which is this one. All right, so let's connect the base pin to that bone. So let's now test it out and see if we are satisfied with the result of it. I'm going to grab the controller to test the movements, and I'm going to raise the arm. It seems that I didn't connect the pin 2 to the hierarchy. Let's connect it back. And now let's bring up the arm. It's following the upper arm, but the problem here is that since these two are two different drawings with different placement of the pins on them, the bend that we get on one won't match to the bend that we get on the other one. I sat down, I tried to make this upper arm to become as rigid as possible by adding more puppet starch pins on it, and yet I was not successful in matching these two drawings together. So eventually I decided to go back to Photoshop and approach it in a different way, and this way also it would give give me the opportunity to show you how we can go back in Photoshop, modify some of our layers, and how we can overcome the challenges using the methods that I can explain to you. So I'm going to go back and bring this controller back to its original position. I'm going to remove these puppet pins even on the sleeve, and we are going to go back to Photoshop and come back in After Effects. Okay, I'm in Photoshop. What I'm trying to do is modify the drawings for the left arm and the left sleeve to be able to have a joint for the sleeve and make this upper part of the sleeve to become a part of the arm itself, so it will bend with the arm drawing. So I opened up my latest file here. Version 15 was my latest version. I'm going to find the left arm and left sleeve and solo them and hide everything else. So similar to the hand, I'm going to make a guide layer so I can define a very circular overlapping shape here. And I'm going to make sure that it's a perfect circle by holding down Shift. I'm going to duplicate it by holding down Alt. I'm going to make sure that it's scaled down in the center. This is going to act as the guide for the center of the circle. So I'm going to merge them, Control E. Now I just made my guide here. I'm going to change the type of the blending mode to multiply so I can see through that. I want to have an upper sleeve here to become this round around this area. And then for the lower part of the sleeve, I'm going to make this round here as well. At the end, this lower part is going to rotate around this center point, and we're not going to notice the break between these two. I'm going to make a copy of my sleeve, Control J, hide the original one, and I'm going to just focus on the upper sleeve. I can use this guide that I've just created to select this round shape here and then add to my selection and then invert my selection and delete the rest of it. I need to fill up this empty pixel. In this case, I'm going to use the stamp tool. I'm going to do the same thing for the lower part of the sleeve. Use the lasso tool to include the entire lower part of the sleeve. Inverse my selection and delete the upper part. I'm using again the stamp tool and draw over that empty spot. And again, I'm going to make sure that I'm having a perfect circular shape. Okay, just to give it a quick test here, I'm going to select the lower sleeve, move the anchor point directly on the center of the guide. Okay, sounds good. I can now merge the upper sleeve with the arm and then name this one the new left arm. It should be exactly the same name that I originally had, otherwise After Effects won't be able to find this. So and now this becomes my new sleeve, which is only the lower part of the sleeve. So now I can actually get rid of the original sleeve, and I'm going to rename this new layer with the same exactly. So that's my new left sleeve and that's my new left arm. It's time now to update our After Effects file with these new drawings. Since we are following the habit of versioning up our progress, I'm going to save this file as a new version, version 16, and I need to master this version 16 again. I can save over my current master file with the exact same name that is going to be a copy of version 16. I'm not worried about saving over my master file because in case things went wrong in After Effects, I can always revert back to my version 15, which was already working. And let's go back into After Effects and see how things will load up in our After Effects file. Let's give it some time to refresh and reload all of the layers. The new sleeve is showing up, though it seems that there are some problems with the arm itself. Let's open up the arm layer just to show you what's going on here. So with the left arm, the problem is that when we added that sleeve, the upper part of the sleeve to the drawing of the arm, the new drawing was a little bit thicker. And since the drawing is now a little bit thicker, After Effects tries to maintain its pivot point in the exact same position of the original thinner arm, which means that the pixels are going to be shifted either to the left or right. And that means that our puppet pins are no longer sitting in the positions that they're supposed to be sitting at. You can see that the wrist is not lined up and the drawing's pixels are shifted to the right. So in such cases, you need to manually reposition the new wider drawing of the arm back into place and then redo whatever you have done with those. In this case, we need to redo all the puppet pins and the bones and everything for this left arm one more time. So in order to make sure that my arm is in its original position, I'm going to turn off this puppet effect here. It means that I wanted to ignore all of the puppet pins. So now you can see that the arm is in a new placement that comes from the new drawings on it. I can simply just delete all of these effects. Unfortunately, I have to delete all the pins and bones and controllers as well. Before I delete these, I'm going to unparent my hand from the setup as well. Now it's safe to delete the bones and the controllers for the left arm. I'm going to find the pins of the left arm as well and delete them. And if you remember, I also zeroed out the values for the left arm controller. That resulted into some extra nulls that might have been shied or hidden, and I'm going to delete that too. Now it's safe to move it around, and I'm using this guide that I had for the hand to help me with the placement of the new arm here. I'm going to also bring this on top of my new arm just to show you how you can bring in a new layer. I'm going to go back to my project window and import a new file. From the master file, I'm going to import only one single layer. So I'm going to change my import kind to footage, and I'm going to choose the ellipse 1 copy and make sure that we are maintaining the layer size. In fact, in this case, document size might be a better option because it will also enforce it to be placed exactly where it's supposed to be. So I'm going to import that only single layer, and I'm going to drop it into my timeline, blending mode to multiply so I can see through that. Keep it in your lily layer folder as well. I'm going to now use this to reposition the new sleeve. I'm holding down Control, by the way, when I'm changing these values to make it a fine adjustment. Just to test it out, I'm going to move the anchor point and I'm going to rotate that. Looks fine. The overlapping drawings are working nicely. Just to make it a little bit more perfect and less visible, I'm going to feather out these areas as well. Okay, now let's test it out. I'm going to save over this. Give it some time to reload that. If not, we can find that sleeve layer and enforce it to update. Yeah, I guess the feather is now helping a little bit more, making sure that we don't notice the break between these two drawings. I'm happy with the result. Let's redo the setup for the left arm and then also rig the sleeve. I'm going to speed up this part since I've done that already before. Okay, the left arm is done. I'm going to hide the bones. Now you can see that since the upper sleeve is a part of the arm, it's going to be always attached perfectly to the drawing itself. I'm going to go back and add that starch tool that I had on the elbow just to make the bend a little bit more pointy. So you can now see that regardless of whether I make it pointy or curvy bend, this sleeve is going to be always a part of that. So now it's time to rig and connect this lower part of the sleeve to the elbow. I'm going to go back to my original default shape and I'm going to find the sleeve and I'm going to start placing the pins for it. Let's turn the pins into layers and I'm going to make the hierarchy on these new pins. And I'm going to connect this pin to the closest bone of my character's arm. So let's find the forearm bone. If I parent it to the elbow, it's going to inherit the rotation of the elbow as well. If not, I can parent it to the shoulder and it's going to inherit only the rotations of the shoulder. Let's just test both of them and see which one gives us better results. I'm going to select the first pin, connect to the elbow for now and test the motions. I think it's rotating too much. Let's also try the upper arm and also see what we get. I think I like this one better. And now I can actually hide these as well. Before I forget, I need to reconnect my arm bone to my torso, layer 16 torso. And I no longer need to see these, so I'm going to shy them. I don't want to see the pins of the sleeve anymore. And the new bones that I've created for the arm, I'm going to hide and shy them as well. And I'm going to check the right arm as well and see if I need to do that separation for the other one. I might end up doing it, so I'm going to just do it while the recording is off.